It's April 14th, 1865. After 4 years of bloody civil war, the United States is ready to move forward. President Abraham Lincoln has just given his famous second inaugural address, calling for a quick end to hostilities and national reconciliation. The Republican president had just won re-election in a landslide over the Democratic candidate, General George B. McClellan. With the Confederacy shattered by General Ulysses S. Grant's relentless campaigns and the armies of the South exhausted and starving, it seemed as though peace was at hand. But in the midst of this hopeful moment, America's 16th president would meet his demise in one of the most shocking assassinations in history. On this day in 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor who was angry about the direction the country was headed. Join us as we explain how John Wilkes Booth managed to assassinate President Lincoln, why he did it, and what happened next. Before we start, remember to give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to learn more about amazing history. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky in 1809 and grew up in Indiana and Illinois. He worked as a lawyer and began to rise in politics before being elected to the House of Representatives in 1846, a strong opponent of slavery. Lincoln was chosen as the Republican candidate in 1860 and won the presidency against the likes of Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge, when 7 Southern states seceded from the Union. In response to his election, Lincoln called for volunteers to put down the rebellion, and so began the American Civil War. For 4 years, Lincoln led the Union through its most trying time as the nation was torn apart by fighting, political intrigue, and assassination attempts. By 1865, however, the Confederacy was all but finished. Richmond, Virginia had been captured by Union troops, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis had fled the capital. Now, as the fighting came to an end, it was clear that the institution of slavery would soon be abolished in the United States forever. In his second inaugural address on March, Lincoln spoke briefly but powerfully to the crowds gathered in Washington, D.C. He stated that his main objective was the preservation of the Union. His second aim was the abolition of slavery. While he didn't express any desire for revenge or retribution, he did make it clear that the South would have to be brought back into the fold if the country was to heal. He ended his speech with the now famous "with malice toward none, with charity for all." These words were meant to signal a new era in American history, and Lincoln hoped that the country could come together and move forward. However, not everyone felt the same way. In the crowd that day listening to Lincoln speak were 2 men who would later play pivotal roles in the events of April. One of these men was John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor from Maryland who had supported the Confederacy since the beginning of the war. At the time, he was part of a theatrical troupe performing in Washington, D.C., when he heard the president speak. The other man was a former house painter named George Astorat, who had become Lincoln's personal bodyguard. After surviving an earlier assassination attempt, that day he overheard a group of Confederate sympathizers discussing Booth and a plan to kidnap the president. While he didn't report it at the time, he did keep a close eye on the actor and would play a key role when the time came. On April, Lincoln decided to attend a performance of the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theatre. As the evening wore on and the show progressed, both Booth and Lincoln's bodyguard became nervous. It wasn't unusual for people to attend presidential performances, but Lincoln had been the target of numerous assassination attempts. So Astaroth kept a close eye on the crowd and anyone who looked suspicious. Booth, meanwhile, was pacing backstage, waiting for his cue. He too was tense, as this night was the culmination of a plan that had taken months to put into action. John Wilkes Booth was a well-known actor in the years before the Civil War, appearing in dozens of plays across the country. During the conflict, however, he became known for something else entirely: his pro-Confederate speeches and inflammatory writings. While never a soldier himself, Booth lobbied for the South and even met with Confederate officials on several occasions. In February of 1865, he wrote a letter to Jefferson Davis outlining his views on how the war could be won, and in the document he outlined some of his theories on waging guerrilla warfare against the North. Davis apparently listened and commissioned Booth to travel to Europe and organize a group of foreign mercenaries who could fight alongside Confederate troops. Upon his return to America, Booth learned that Richmond had fallen and the Confederacy was on the verge of collapse. Feeling that the war was lost and the South had no hope of winning, he hatched a plan to kill Lincoln and take the country back. He recruited several accomplices, including his brother Edwin, and friends Lewis Powell and George Atzerodt. Together, they planned to kidnap the president and hold him for ransom. However, after learning that Lincoln would attend a performance at Ford's Theatre, Booth changed his plans and opted to simply kill the president. On the night of April 14th, his group split into three branches. Booth would attack Lincoln at the theatre. Lewis Powell would go to the private home of Secretary of State William Seward to act. He was seriously wounded, but Seward miraculously survived. George Atzerodt was assigned to Vice President Andrew Johnson, but he was too scared, drank, and quit. If the plan succeeded, the entire U.S. government would fall into chaos overnight. To get close enough to Lincoln, he managed to get 2 tickets to the show under the alias Mr. Willis. He then slipped a pistol into a small space between the velvet curtains of the box where the Lincolns would sit. The rest would be up to chance. As the play progressed, Lincoln and his wife Mary, along with their son Robert and a friend, Major Henry Rathbone, took their seats. Booth waited in the wings for the right moment. Then, when he thought he had it, he made his move. As the first act drew to a close, Booth slipped out of the orchestra pit and into the presidential box where Lincoln sat. Around 10 p.m., during the performance of Our American Cousin, Booth quietly entered the VIP box. He waited for the right moment for the audience to laugh at a funny line, and he acted. After a bang, Lincoln seriously injured in the head. Lincoln's wife was surprised as Lincoln slumped over in his seat, mortally wounded. Booth jumped over the railing and landed on the stage. He then ran into an accomplice waiting in the wings from there. He calmly walked out into the audience, across the street and down an alleyway, making his way to a horse that was waiting to take him out of the city. Meanwhile, a doctor was rushing to Lincoln's side, while the play continued for another 20 minutes without the knowledge of the audience. Lincoln was carried to a house across the street from Ford's Theatre. He never regained consciousness. As the morning of April dawned, the country awoke to the news that their president was dead. People poured into the streets in shock as the enormity of what had happened slowly sunk in. While Lincoln had died around 7:22 a.m., his death wasn't officially announced until 11 hours later to avoid panic. Even then, it wasn't certain if the vice president, Andrew Johnson, would take over or whether Congress would name someone else. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln's assassin was enjoying a night of revelry with his friends. According to those who knew Booth, he was in high spirits after shooting the president and celebrated by drinking heavily and smoking cigars. The actor went into hiding, moving from house to house in the rural areas surrounding Washington. D.C. meanwhile, soldiers and civilians alike set out to hunt him down. An all-out manhunt ensued, under the command of Colonel James W. Powell. Union troops searched every building, cave and hollow log in the area. Booth, meanwhile, seemed to know the countryside like the back of his hand and managed to elude his pursuers time and again. He was aided by several accomplices who left food and supplies for him along the way. Finally, on April, after only 12 days on the run, soldiers tracked Booth to a farmhouse in Virginia. They surrounded the building and gave the people inside one last chance to surrender. When Booth refused, the soldiers set fire to the barn where he was hiding. The building quickly caught on fire and collapsed, killing Booth and ending his life. His body was recovered, and alongside the bodies of his co-conspirators, Lincoln's assassin had finally gotten his just deserts. Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in his home state of Illinois after a funeral procession that lasted almost a week. Millions of mourners lined the train route and paid their respects to the man considered by many to be the greatest American president of all time. And that's what happened on this day in history. Do you think Lincoln got the presidential protection he deserved? Why do you think Booth killed him? Let us know your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a like. We'll see you next time.